It's time to raid a base. It's time to get resources. But it's also time to explain why this is called a piracy server and not just a PvP server. Because there are some fundamental differences in the gameplay that's trying to be achieved. So I'm going to go over what really is piracy gameplay, how it fixes some of the PvP issues in games like Space Engineers, and let you see how that plays out during the raid on this base. All that is coming up right now. So I'm starting this raid by taking out its surface defenses. This base, in terms of its production and storage, is pretty much an underground facility, I think. So it requires me neutralizing any threats on the surface, then breaking into the base and taking any resources, at least resources that I might need. In the last episode, I showed how Boromino had moved his giant rover away from the base, and his rover was also his main point of defense. So without attacking and destroying his rover, I created some small outposts to ambush his rover should he try to bring it back to the base, which he could try to do right in the middle of this raid. I'm going to be giving more examples, but that kind of non-direct attack approach is fundamentally at the core of this piracy concept. In real life, I'm sure there were some bloodthirsty pirates that were in it just purely for the glory of the kill, but the vast majority of pirates were more interested in acquiring loot than the hack and slash. When possible, pirates would run down another ship, fire a few warning shots, get their victims to stop their boat, and then, purely under the threat of superiority, would take the money and provisions they wanted, even to the point of forcing their victims' crew to do the rather demeaning task of moving the goods over themselves. Fear, intimidation, extortion. These were the preferred tools used by the pirates, because it allowed them to get what they want with minimal collateral damage to either side. I could have brought one of my ships over and just performed a cannon or artillery bombardment on this base to take out the small turrets, but that would have caused a lot of additional damage, even if I just used some small Gatling guns, which is one of the primary rules on this piracy server, which is to have no unnecessary damage, not directly related to the acquisition of resources, or at least make every attempt to minimize that damage whenever possible. Having taken out the turrets, I started hacking and taking over some of these control panels to see if I couldn't take control of however to open this base and get inside. Now, I could have just blown a few holes in different parts of the base to get in, but those kinds of aerial bombardments that destroy people's builds are actually what we're trying to avoid with this piracy concept. It doesn't mean there won't be a little bit of collateral damage here and there, but it means you need to think a little more tactically about how to take out someone's defenses and get into their base without causing a lot of damage, which I think probably even creates a little more strategic and creative gameplay over just the brute force approach a lot of players use in Space Engineers, where the guy with the most guns or biggest guns wins. What I found out at this base is that there is a sensor-activated platform that takes you down to the lower level. Once inside, I did do a little scouting, because there may have been some interior turrets down here hidden about. So I finished a little recon to first make sure the coast was clear. With everything seemingly safe, I started the next bit of work, which was to hack these storage containers so I could see what was inside. Hacking is probably one of the least destructive things you can do to still carry out your piracy. Let's assume you did break into someone's base and drain them completely of every last bit of resource they'd stored. At least with hacking, all they have to do is grind back down the item and restore it back with the welder to have it completely functional again. It requires no resources. On this particular raid, I couldn't resist though taking the most valuable item currently in the game, the Space Engineer plushie. I might have to use this for some sort of ransom gameplay later, I don't know, but it felt like the best find ever. So I'm taking it for now, and I'll figure out how to use this for some sort of creative gameplay later. I also took the zone chip in the zone generator, but Later, I realized that this was actually a violation of another server rule, where you're not allowed to take zone chips under any condition. They're just too valuable and too expensive. And I've got some other gameplay planned for this server that may involve those chips. So I put it back and returned the zone chip to its rightful place. I checked out his base a little bit, and he had a couple nice builds down here. There was a pretty stylish looking flight welder and some kind of rover it looked like would be good for welding up floors. But I was also nervous. The owner could return at any time, so I just needed to get on with business. But taking these components was going to take a little time, so I set up some of my own defenses. On the walls, in the lower level, I installed 2 interior turrets. These would be owned by me, so if I got interrupted during my act of piracy, I'd have my own built-in defense. Now, this might have been a little bit cheeky, but I decided to leave these interior turrets in place when I'd leave. It would be a kind of booby trap for the owner, and it would definitely cause a bit of nuisance. Now, I did take some care, and I made it so that the turrets would only target characters, and not any other sort of enemy items. Otherwise, they would have just started firing and destroying stuff everywhere. In truth, they actually did for a couple seconds, but these interior turrets don't cause a lot of damage, and I turned it off almost immediately. Now, I did think this through just a little bit. I saw that he had his cryo chamber and medbay down here pretty much in full view of these interior turrets, and I didn't want to create a griefing situation where he dies, spawns back in front of his medbay, gets shot and dies, respawns again, and just creates this vicious cycle. So to break that cycle, I hacked the medbay, so it no longer functioned as a spawn point for his character. Most likely, Borromino had a survival kit or medbay on his big rover, because he was going to use it for long-range exploration. But if he didn't, at minimum, he would have spawned back at his faction's safe zone base, which was just a few hundred kilometers away. So it wasn't going to create any severe hardship, just a bit of challenge for him to get back in and retake his base, which is part of my role here on this server as a pirate. Not only to just occasionally acquire resources, but to provide a little interesting challenge gameplay beyond creative building, but to do it in a way that doesn't create excessive damage and cause people to lose days or weeks that they've spent carefully constructing their projects, or at least try the best I can. There's got to be a way to engage in player-to-player conflict without resorting to destroying people's hard work and creative builds. So that's what I'm experimenting with here on this piracy server, applying some player threat and challenge, but preserve as much of the player-built creativity as possible. I hacked one of his assemblers so I could actually create some ammo for these interior turrets. Yes, I was using his own assembler and his resources to create bullets that would be used against him. It happens. I also built back the exterior turrets, but now with them in my control, they'd act just like the interior turrets and would be another obstacle that Borromino would have to overcome. To help with retrieving the materials, I hacked a connector so I could directly attach my welder ship I was going to use to ferry out the materials. One thing that caused me a fair bit of problems that I didn't touch in any way were his conveyor sorters. He had them set up in a way that wasn't allowing me to pull out some materials like raw ores back into these surface connectors. But I didn't hack them or change their setup in any way. This is mainly because I know that it can be a little tricky to get conveyor sorters set up and working exactly like you want to move goods from point A to point B in your production chain. So I left that completely alone. I didn't want to create any unnecessary grief for anyone, having spent a lot of time figuring out a setup that worked the way they wanted. I did get locked inside once from his sensor setup, but even when I ground my way out removing a block, I fixed it and put it back exactly like I found it. So I got my goods. I got back home, and I did it without really disturbing his base in any permanent way. and was able to leave a little calling card in the way of a handful of interior turrets that would simply act as a nuisance and challenge to overcome, and not a game-breaking experience. There's a couple other server rules that also prevent unfair gameplay, like hopping from faction to faction to get access to a faction's own resources or to instantly locate other players belonging to that faction. That's also strictly forbidden. It's not part of the piracy roleplay being created in this DadSpeed environment where we like to sometimes have fun and mix it up, but being respectful of other people's bills and the time they've spent comes first. If you're interested in joining this server, you can find a link to the DadSpeed Discord that has the server rules and other information. Watch the next episode for my light fighter build and an experimental build that might not even be possible in the game, but I'm giving it a try. See you next time.